Hey, and we're live. Sorry, everybody, we're 1 minute late. And we are actually waiting on Ryan because Ryan messaged us a few minutes ago that his internet is out. He's on the phone with Comcast, I think it was. We can give a little bit of prelude in the meantime. And please forgive me while I tweet out that we're live briefly too. And we're live. I think people who have tuned in before are probably familiar with who our group is today. We have me, Adam, and Manu. And why don't I just kick things off a little bit with a tiny bit of background and why we think this topic is a particularly funny topic for this group. And so while Ryan sorts out his internet issues, which I agree, he's going to be a very solid guest. I love your comments, Glenn. Let me give a little bit of background. One thing I love about the topic of this stream is we get to talk about Miško in Miško's absence, which is my favorite thing to do. So what I want to give is a little bit of background on Quick and Quick City and how I think everybody in this group didn't want to build these things, but it came to the realization it was a necessity and then very much leaned into that. And so let me give a funny story of Miško really quickly. So when I first met Miško, Builder was in a state where we were very proud. You know, we have this whole system for like a low code, like drag and drop environment that you integrate in your code base with components, kind of Figma style editing with your components and publish to go live. And the thing we felt we really nailed the most was the performance angle, making what was distributed to your website insanely high performance, whether it's static content or dynamic, like personalized content, like choose variations to show different audiences, A/B test, stuff like that. Really solved performance issues on how a lot of personalization and A/B testing were done in the past, while getting the same benefit of like a non-developer can produce these things with some type of GUI that's not overly restrictive, so the developers are maintaining too much code. So that was great until we started realizing that people were adopting Builder for the performance benefits and finding their website still had performance issues. And they would go back to us and say, hey, Builder populated this page. And we had to say, oh, well, your React framework plus your third-party scripts, you know, this is the stuff that's adding that weight. And so I started obsessing over how can Builder be generating something. Hey, Ryan made it. Let's take a pause and say hi to Ryan, our special guest. It's probably having poor internet. I'll keep going. And then once Ryan's connection settles, we definitely want to focus on our star guest. But anyway, I'll keep giving the backstory on Miško and Quick really quickly. So we started realizing that, you know, Builder could output to React code, Vue code, Svelte, Solid, all those things. And we found that no matter what we outputted to, we could satisfy every requirement from like a good best practice code perspective. Might be here. Ryan, is it working? Almost.
Barely? I don't know. Yeah,
Yes.
okay, I can hear you now. Okay. It's like I'm hearing all robots though, so I don't know. I think maybe it's metered coming through my phone. I did not get the internet working, unfortunately.
But sounds like, yeah, using something off of your phone. Can you hear us legibly enough, even if we sound robotic and crazy? No.
Yeah, I don't. This might not work. I'm getting a lot of noise, and I don't know if it's the same on the outbound channel.
We can hear you well and fine, but sounds like the big problem is if you can't hear us. The video keeps getting more clear. Worst case, we could always have you like shut off video and we stick to audio. I'm open to whatever. Maybe I'll keep going on my backstory on Quick while we settle out technical issues. Unless, Ryan, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay. I don't think so. I'll give a little more prelude as Ryan kind of messes with the technical elements. But basically, we came to the conclusion that, you know, you could output to good quality idiomatic performance best practices code of any framework and still struggle to get a very good performance score. That's where we started messing around with, can we deliver applications just without the JavaScript? The more you profile it, the more you continuously find that the JavaScript is what's weighing things down. The amount you have to download, parse, and execute was a major factor for poor performance. And so we started messing around with Builder. Well, can Builder just shotgun raw HTML to you? And somehow, how in the world would you be able to then make it interactive? It was unclear. That's where I ran into Miško. And Mishko's like, hey, I've got this new framework, which we talked about before, he called QOOT, and it can output essentially load a page of pure HTML, but still be interactive. Just a few bytes of JavaScript and this very clever resumability technique can give you that. And that was like a big thing. But one thing he was adamant about is, one, this will not be a new framework. We will hook into other frameworks to do the rendering. React could be the component rendering, or Solid, which was our preference, or something else. Very, very hardcore about that. Then two, we don't want to build meta frameworks. And I'll jump over to Adam in a minute, but Adam was double on that. Like, no meta frameworks. We don't want to be building. Next.js is a great project. There's others out there. We don't want to build our own. It's complicated. It's not something we should
just
take
like
on.
2 hours before deciding of the opposite. No, it's
What's that?
just like 2 hours before deciding to do the meta framework. The very standing position was like, no way. Like that.
Well, it was
the level of.
That's the thing. We were very much, and I'll stop talking in a minute because I want to hear both of your point of view, and I'm hoping we'll get Ryan in. If we don't, we can have a follow-up where we go deeper on that. But the overwhelming point of view, which stuck for a while, then eventually I can even just fast forward. I mean, we tried so hard to get Quick to work within other frameworks without adding additional cruft, and it's very hard when the whole thing is like insanely lightweight. Any weight brings the performance down, and everything added some weight. And then it was like, well, let's get other rendering systems inside Quick, but it was always everything added weight. And the whole point was to have no weight. We basically landed on when you adopt resumability, there's a way you have to load things that is so unique. And this is kind of why, I don't know if people know this. Last thing I'll say before I want to have others jump in. Mishko gave a talk in like anybody know the year, where he basically showed how Angular could become resumable?
I think he said 2017-ish. He has 3, 4
it was like
a while ago, yeah.
Angular conference, Salt Lake City or something. He like laid it all out how basically Angular could adopt this technique, and then just found there's a series of major headaches. It's so hard to adopt with the way every framework is approaching things today. And so I'll shut up now because Mono wants to jump in. I want to have
I was thinking that's why like Adam, Mishko really knows this problem, right? Like when we talk about this, like other frameworks might do it, he has this strong opinion of good luck, and it's not really like being like superior. It's like he's been into this problem for so many years now. Like how many? Like so it's you can understand that when you realize that there's this topic like since that year.
Well, Manu, like, okay, so you guys, one question I want to hear, Adam, a bunch of takes too, but like, remind me when we came to you and we're like, hey, we're making a framework. I'm pretty sure you were like, don't want to be a part of that. But remind me sort of what your point of view was.
Yeah, that's pretty close. I think the thing is that there's a new framework every day, right? There's a new one, and every single homepage of those frameworks talk about how they're the fastest, they're the next generation, they are the smallest. And I could easily get 200 examples of that. And so to say like we're building another framework is like, oh, here we go again, right? So I think the thing that's different was that as Mishko was demoing it and things like that, and showing how it would actually work, is like, wait, this actually is different. It takes a little. It actually took a little while to digest of like, this actually does work differently. It's not just a slightly faster of the same thing, or a slightly different looking component, but under the hood, it's pretty much the same concept. I think that's the big thing that sold me on what was cute at the time, and I'm glad we've ditched that name for Quick instead. But no, like it's I think that's the big thing, is like the more you understand how Quick works and how the serialization works, that's the faster it is. If you're like, okay, this actually is different. This actually I can see how it can perform better. And that's what it was really. And then the idea that I think the other thing that often or would scare me off is Svelte, the latest and greatest, the new hot thing that's been out since 2016. And that's still, it's still compared to the npm downloads of React, it's not even close. So I think that's the stuff that also scares me, and not scare me, but like I think that's something to take into account, that like it's not easy to just go against React, because React is dominant for a good reason. And so to say we're gonna build a new framework to replace React, that's a lofty goal.
That was actually the other big thing that continuously came up is we are not competing with React. It was like we're complementing, we're augmenting, we're working around, we're working on other use cases, and more and more. And I'm not thinking any of us are trying to go saying, hey, everybody, if you're looking at React, you should use Quick. It's not really that broadly applicable today. In fact, our strengths are in specific areas that React really falls apart with at scale. So I think today it's like, hey, certain people, I would say in a lot of cases, some non-trivial website or app that really needs a good time to interactive and maybe doesn't need an insane amount of existing React ecosystem. Like maybe your development team is not all junior developers. They don't need this absurd amount of courses, docs, third-party everything out there, because that just won't exist for Quick today. And you probably are going to need to have the TTI problem enough that it matters enough to your business to justify any type of movements. Now, the good news is, in where we still think Quick has a special place in the ecosystem, part of it's definitely inspired by Astro. This is something we've talked about for a while, even before learning about Astro, but Astro definitely showed how elegant and abstract this can be is using your React components within Quick. So while we found it was not necessarily the best approach to make it the default render of all things, pulling it in to pull from existing components you have, which is helping us with migrating more builder stuff to Quick, or using it to take advantage of sort of third-party libraries, Material UI, design systems, stuff like that, can be a super duper interesting technique. I'm curious, Manu, coming from sort of the stencil background, so I think you all did a pretty amazing job fitting sort of the web component model to a very high-speed thing. Like, what was your first impression of if you wanted to, if the next thing you wanted to do was make a framework again or not?
So I remember I have kind of like first, I think it was, I remember like Adam texted me like, I really want, like we worked before and we were already like split for some months. We were working in different places. And he has like, he made me to this meeting, like, let's have this meeting with Mishko and him. And we have a new framework. And indeed, I was like, all right, let's see. And I remember one of the first things is that it was kind of like ugly. I remember that. I remember like, this is cool. This is a cool idea. I'm not sure how. So I'm sold of the idea and the problem. I'm just not sold of that in the current state of the art of, the current developer community is going to adopt this, because I don't know, like right now it's kind of, it's very different, right? Like before it was like injector here, you have to declare this crazy string with this crazy syntax manually, and then and we're like, I don't know, guys, but the developer experience needs to be improved. And I think that was kind of what I saw myself when I joined the team. Like the idea was set. I was like, how we can make this like amazing for developers, and I think we are in a better spot now.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think the core concept is the same. But if you were to look at that first example and look at what's on the homepage now example, it's not even close to the same. Yeah. It's more or less the React DX, right? It's got it's got a functional component that returns JSX. So if you're familiar with React, you're familiar with Quick.
The funny thing about this is that now it seems obvious, but in many of these moments you were like, actually we can make it this way, and it was like, no, this is impossible, and like we cannot make it like functional and all this stuff. It's impossible. And then realizing like how things actually work, making like kind of changing our mental model of how things work to develop this. Like it's not trivial. Now it's like there and everything makes sense, but it took like a lot of iteration. I recall like you, Steve, you were kind of a bit pissed of the amounts of refactors we went through. No, like it was a kind of a thing. Like this needs to work, and this is the last one.
I do remember that. Yeah, one of the biggest things that yet another reason not to build another framework is, like we saw, SolidJS took years before it was sort of in that state where it was really picking up traction. Svelte as well, React as well, Angular as well. These things take forever. And so it was definitely like a whole thing of like, if we're going to do this, can we get things out? And actually, I do think the pace on the Quick side is pretty crazy. And I mean, traction is the last thing that will be sort of the thing that tells. And we're seeing it though already. I mean, obviously the initial traction of anything starts with small projects. The gigantic, Microsoft.com doesn't want to be the very first to try a new technology. They will probably hit the biggest issues if something is not well fleshed out. You start kind of small-ish, and those are easier to get live sooner anyway and kind of work your way up. And that's what we're seeing, which is nice. And so we're seeing sort of the fruits of that labor pay off. And we are seeing that the resumability technique is hard to make a good DX around, and it's very hard, like we talked about, to retrofit an existing framework. I know there's a lot of conversations about, and I'm curious what you guys think about this. Like, for instance, this could be a good one to kick to you, Adam, but I'm curious what you think about the conversations around, like, you know, like Rich Harris will say, like, oh, we're waiting to observe what evolves out of all this work to pursue progressive hydration, minimal or no hydration, and then essentially borrow the best ideas we find. And, you know, we agree with that approach, but given Mishko's experience with Angular and now, you know, Adamano, your experience with Stencil, you know, it very much seems like this is anywhere from extremely hard to impossible, and be wildly written with breaking changes for the entire ecosystem of an existing framework. So, you know, someone like Svelte might have their Angular 2 moment, so to speak, where everybody's upset because everything breaks and everything needs to be remade, adopting this approach potentially. But please tell me, Adam, what is your point of view on this?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge to like realize is, if you think of a React functional component, it returns some JSX. Inside of there, you're going to have an on-click listener, which has a function inside of it. And so to know about that click listener means you have to render it, right? Which is like, well, it's fairly obvious, right? But again, you have to render it to know it exists, to then attach it to the DOM. And so that's kind of a core concept with Quick that maybe we don't talk about enough, is like how that kind of separates those two. So how you write it's the same. So everyone's familiar with how to write an on-click listener in JSX, but internally, we're able to pick those apart. And because we picked those apart, and because we moved kind of the listener out of the renderer, that's the big thing that's you just can't plug and play. You just say like, oh, we're going to do that too, because that actually requires quite a bit of refactoring. And then if you move that function out and it's doing something else, like, well, within that function, it was expecting this, you know, scope to have this variable available. So in the simplest example, maybe you can move that listener out of that closure, but then all of a sudden, whatever that closure was doing inside of there is going to stop working. And so that's kind of the core thing that is just not easy to, we're going to add this to type of thing, because it kind of really changes everything about how the frameworks work.
And then, since you're still focused, Adam, another question for you I'm dying to get to is, you're the creator of Quick City, the meta framework over Quick that makes it feel like let's just call it a Next.js analogous develop experience. You are the most hardcore about we should never, ever not do that. So what was the thought process? What changed your mind? What was your thoughts then versus now?
I think from the very beginning, just like, well, Next.js has been out since like 2016. Gatsby has been out since 2014-ish. You know, Svelte Kits, so it's like a long time to get this stuff developed. And I think that's the scary stuff. Then you go through the repo of Next.js, and it is just massive. I don't know how many thousands of files that they have. And so the whole idea behind that is like, that's terrifying. I don't want to maintain all of that stuff. I think one big difference is that we're using Vite instead, or Vite. And we're basically still putting it on the shoulders of Vite to do a lot of the heavy lifting, a lot of the build process, a lot of how, you know, the live reload. There's a lot of core logic that Vite does for us and does for everybody. And then there's a huge ecosystem behind Rollup and Vite that we're able to leverage, versus having to create yet another CLI. And
that was another of the things, right? Because we went through the suffering in Stencil. We kind of build Vite for Stencil too. And it's like, we kind of know that in order to make this build tool work with everything is a mess. Like, kind of Byte is a mess. Our Stencil was a mess, because you need to make sure this works with CommonJS, like all these different use cases, right?
Yes.
But it's kind of like, better we are not the ones writing it, and kind of like the whole ecosystem, right? And it was kind of also like a super strong thing to not do. And at least for now, we are achieving that.
It wasn't a mistake that we didn't create a CLI. That was a very let's use an existing system. Vite has been around for a little bit here, so it's kind of proven itself, doing great. For the user, I think Vite is perfect. We've been able to just like enable it through plugins, and I think that's the ideal. And then it also doesn't tie us to Vite, right? So like we can, whatever the next thing is, we have a build system, and it shouldn't really break anything, or that's the idea behind it. It's like, we don't want to provide a CLI. And so that was kind of the realization of like, okay, we could just create a Vite plugin called Quick City that could enable all these things that we want to do. We could bury that inside of this plugin, which really is not even tied to Vite. It's kind of its own separate package that Vite just knows how to call into. And that goes the same for Quick's optimizer too. And so I think that was kind of another realization. And then you look at like, okay, so Next.js, Docusaurus, Gatsby, all of them, they have some sort of way of like, when I click the link, it needs to do client-side routing. So it's like, there's a lot of logic inside of their React code of like how it's able to do that. Or if a Remix is a React router and all this, there's a lot of logic of deciding, how do I lazy load this code? How did I build this huge, massive route map and these regexes? So there's a lot of code behind that I think it eventually hit us of just like, well, really, there's not that much to it with Quick, because Quick is able to, we didn't run a lot of code again to begin with. Like we really is just kind of this SSR at this certain point of like, if we can just make a regex of this path equals this thing, let's just render this code. And at that point, it's really up to Quick to do the right thing. They really lazy load at the right points, and they're, all the different codes. So like, that was another big realization of just like, there's really not much to this. It's really kind of a build step that would, just like all the meta frameworks at this point, I think that meta frameworks are very comparable. I don't think one is drastically better in DX than the next one. They all kind of have the same core concepts of file-based routing, dynamic route parameters, things like that. So they all kind of provide kind of the same core concepts. And Quick City does that too. I think one big difference is that Quick City has unminified about 4 kilobytes of code. And even then, you're probably not going to download that because of how Quick works and the core concepts of it. So we take a lot of the, are inspired by a lot of the good ideas from Next.js, especially the Next.js RFC proposal for nested layouts. Svelte a lot of inspiration, Remix for sure, and how to do the loaders and the actions. But we're able to bring that into Quick City, and even a more of a basic approach of like an on-get request. And then we're going to do the response to that. And so we're even more agnostic to like, this is the Quick City way of doing it, is like, this is how we're going to handle the request response. And so with that, we can then tie into any server. So any server can handle request response, whether it's Next.js, Cloudflare pages, you name it. As long as it can handle request response, we can run it on that server. And so you're now coding in like a serverless, that's not the wrong term, because you're now coding you're not specific to a certain server. You're basically just somehow having a request response, writing the same code, just like the benefits of Next.js and all of them, where we like in the same file, you can have your MongoDB call, and you can also have your JSX, and you can also have it all typed so they all play with each other nicely. And so I think that's the sweet spot, is that we're able to kind of enable that also. But really a majority of why Quick City is so small and is able to stay so fast is because of the core concepts of it, and leveraging all of its lazy loading capabilities.
I remember that the kind of the switch to make the decision was that you need to own the root to bring the best performance. We have these experiments where you have a React app or like Angular app, and you could have some Quick inside, because Quick, it's HTML first. So in theory, it can just be inside any framework, right? It's not like a complicated thing. However, you will never get the same like performance, right? You kind of need to own the root. I think that's why also like Astro is the root, right? Like Astro needs to be at the very root, and it needs to orchestrate this, right? So kind of the first level, I remember, like Quick needs to be the root to get the best performance. And then the next level was, well, kind of in the current state of JavaScript, it's expected that you have something to make this easy, right? And the way to do it is not to add it to the core framework, but to another layer of the framework. And I think this is something to learn from the React community, because if we remember, like Angular tried to do everything. Angular was the framework, the render, tooling, the routing, and then you have all these breaking changes. And React took this more holistic behavior of saying this is the runtime, very, very slow, very, very small. And I think in Quick, we are kind of not being that much as React, because that has also a lot of problems. So we want to own the bundling and the other kinds of things, right, that we think is important. But then for the routing, it's like a meta framework, right? We don't want to put this in the core. And it's kind of expected, right? If you don't have a meta framework, you want to build your own routing, I think you're going to miss most of the benefits. And I think it was we kind of decided we kind of have to do it for real application, not just like Hello World, but actually real applications to support them. So that, I remember that was kind of the switch back then.
Yeah, and I also think that the fun part with the development of Quick is making sure, like, we've always had SSR first as the concept of like, how is this going to run on the edge? So it's been very first thing is like, this needs to work great in SSR, and then we'll add in client capabilities, and so like the best example is that just this week, we've been so focused on SSR and how the routes would work and being able to render it as fast as possible, but also keeping in mind, like, well, we also want to do client-side routing. Manu, you did it in what, 3 hours? You added client-side routing to Quick City, so like going at this direction where we've had the benefit of seeing how other frameworks have had to do SSR with an existing framework, and the kind of what they've had to make, get static props, get server-side props, and how that stuff is going to, they made that work for React, versus Quick's development has been kind of SSR first. And with that core concept already in place, adding Quick City to it was actually fairly simple, and adding client-side routing was quite simple. And so I think that's been, to our benefit, that we've been able to be looking to see how, a lot of them work today.
Yeah, and I would say, and I'm curious what both of your point of view on this. In retrospect, I think despite our initial hesitation, and then with those realizations that we don't have to, we're not reinventing the wheel here. We're actually just we're basically just translating all the best in the ecosystem to the resumable approach, and finding that helps us kind of move quickly. The resumable approach actually is quite natural to these types of things. And in particular, we get these sort of surprise benefits too, which I think is fascinating. So like, a couple things on here. One is the implementation of some of these things are shockingly trivial. And actually the client-side routing, there's two things I want to dig into that are just recent developments that I think relate to this. We also, I say we, I mean, you two, mostly Manu, added effectively sort of streaming, right? And what's fascinating is this is streaming like React Server Components, but with zero runtime. This is pure HTML that's being delivered, and it's pure HTML at rest as well. It's not like HTML then hydrate, as opposed to React Server Components, which actually there is still a full virtual DOM React runtime needed to load any of this into actual sort of DOM when you're sending these streamed in bits from the server. And I've seen different implementations between Hydrogen and what Next.js is doing. But there's also, I think it's funny, there was a comment in here too, you kind of briefly said serverless, like, wait, that's another thing. But it's like this complete agnosticism, like runs anywhere. And that's the whole idea, like runs anywhere, produces HTML, and the HTML could pick up anywhere as well, which is just fascinating to see sort of as we go through the motions, all of these emergent benefits. And it's just one of those mindset shifts, like when you went from jQuery to AngularJS, or you might have adopted Knockout, or you might have adopted React. It's a different way of thinking that comes with all these new benefits, and many of which are still sort of being explored, which is fascinating. But I want to circle back to, Manu, the recent developments on client-side routing, which I think just given the way Quick works and the optimizer like can pull into the client just the templates, like just the little bits that need to render, which is almost like React Server Components. All the dependencies that come from things like event handlers are not pulled in for that, which is fascinating in itself, to the sort of streaming and the serializing of unresolved promises, which you just started mentioning before the stream, which is crazy enough. I'm curious to hear you a bit about, like, okay, in retrospect, we decided to take on all of this. And what's your feeling on how it's going and how well sort of the Quick resumable approach meets sort of the needs of where the ecosystem's going?
So I think, we pretty new what we, I think that the streaming can happen like at two levels, right? One of the first level is instead of having to have the whole HTML finish, you can just start to ship chunks, right? Like, but finish chunks. So maybe you have 3 components and like in sequentially in the DOM, and you can just put the first one and second one and the third one. That's kind of the one that it can be implemented without any sort of JavaScript, right? You can just, if you have the right the right framework, it's something that Solid does really well with the transform to server, because they just concat strings. The other level is how we actually can zip the whole DOM, and maybe there's a piece in the middle that is missing, right? And this can be also implemented in 2 ways, but you need some JavaScript because you need at some point to update something, right? So it's But the idea is that in Quick, using the same serialization primitives, right? We can serialize things that are obvious. You can serialize a string, a number. It's like there's not much to it. But we are starting to realize that we can serialize unresolved promises. So this is, I think, is very interesting because you don't have to think about it. It's just like you can serialize through the network an application that has unresolved promises. And as these promises resolve in the server, you will get the response in the streaming in the client. So you can kind of like zip very fast, and it's per component level. It's not like something per page. You can kind of have your own little component, and that little component can say, if this little thing that has to do this fetch in the server hasn't responded in 1 minute, actually just render some loading, and serialize a pending resolve that later we are going to stream the response, and it's going to kick in and replace the thing. So it's kind of like to that level we can get using the same primitives. So it's not like a big refactor. We're just realizing that we can use these primitives for these kind of things. And it's mind-blowing because it doesn't require any special API or any special like thing.
Yeah,
right? It's like natural.
That's what I was going to say, is like it really is what we're going to be able to enable. It's still the identical how the user would write the code. They're still going to have on-click listeners. They're still going to have, how they write the JSX, how the component is built. Everything's the same. And in the same file, they can have this product call, the shopping cart example. Actually, I think a really good example would be, the shopping cart page where you want to respond as fast as possible, that HTML, that shell, and then like the little loading spinner inside of it. But on that exact same HTTP response, it's still waiting to get that data. And so really you kicked off, when you did the initial request for the shopping cart, you kicked off the request for the HTML, which responded as fast as possible. But you also kicked off the database call for the shopping cart, which might take a second. And so after that second is done, the user's been looking at a spinner for a second. It then streams, right? It basically plops the HTML back into the correct spot. And then the HTTP response finishes. If any of that makes sense.
This reminds me of this gift, the one with a board.
Charlie?
Trying to like explain, I don't know from what TV show it is.
Yeah,
like
Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
Like, and then it goes like this, the promise, But the thing is that they don't have to have this. Developer doesn't have to think about it. I think that's the most, like, internal details. We can probably talk about it, but it's natural. It's a promise, and even that the resolve of that promise can be a reference to an object that already existed. So it's kind of crazy. Like, it doesn't have to be like a string. It can be actually an object, a nested object with circular reference that point to things that it was already in the page, and that include a reference to an element. That's the kind of things it can be serialized in the unresolved promise.
We are going all Charlie Day on this stuff. But one last point is that component that can do this, that shopping cart component, there is no special server only component code. You can't do a click listener on it. You can't, like, there's none of that. It's still entirely how you would naturally write these components.
I'm maybe I don't know if I'm just recalling a talk we gave a long time ago about Stencil, and we have this kind of like a history lessons about this, jQuery, AngularJS, React, and the whole point of it was in that time the kind of the point of the talk was like, now there is so many frameworks, so we built a Stencil to kind of target all of them and build their other coworkers in Builder build mitosis for the same problem, right? But now also thinking that in all of these moments, kind of the frameworks will build for a different reason. Like I can just say, like, jQuery was kind of built to cover the lacks of JavaScript. Like, it was not trying to be beautiful or anything. It was just like JavaScript cannot do much, so just put this into a little like library. And then AngularJS kind of focus more into DX and building big things. And we are like in a different phase, no? Like I don't know what you guys think. Like, we're kind of in this phase of something else. It's not.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. And I think one thing that's drastically different and fairly recent, all things considered, is kind of the serverless architecture. Like, back in the day, I knew how to create a, Apache server and IIS on Windows and stuff like that. Like, I have no idea how to do that stuff today. Like, I don't know what the latest and greatest way to build a server. It's entirely like, I'm just going to push it to Vercel or Cloudflare Pages, and it's going to do its magic on the edge, running much faster. So I think that capability has freed us up to build these frameworks for that new scenario that exists, where now we can leverage, what's available on the edge. And like this example again of personalization on the edge, of like, we want to respond as fast as possible to that user that might be on the subway bus somewhere in wherever. But then that database call to get that user information can take a half second from the database and fill it in as fast as possible. And I think that was something, the architecture to do that is now much, much easier than it used to be. And so like, I kind of feel like we're given these abilities to solve new problems rather than trying to like, what's the best way to make an app?
Yeah. And what's funny too, for me, is like, especially on the note of like the constant commentary on the very unspectacular release of React 18, like all this build up, years of build up, and then just kind of that seemingly nothing. And I mean, we're seeing, so there's, Adam, you said one thing, which is like, there's no server components or concept of the server versus client component. And that's something that's very natural to Quick, is this idea that is, I don't know how much I want to do hot takes on live recorded stuff, but I like a lot of things about React server components. I have a lot of issues with the server versus client component divide. In practice, I've just seen it get very complicated to build and refactor your code. And I've seen how wildly simple it is to just have a component that can run and resume anywhere. And so with this idea also of, what does Michiko call it again? I want to call it frames. It's containers. With containers. Yeah. And it inspired in part by Marco's feature around sort of like, I forgot what it was called, but it was these sort of like pre-cached areas you don't have to re-render. The idea that you can have like part of your application in a container. This is part of the micro front end's idea too. Part of application can come off a server. Part can cover the cache. Part can execute at the edge. Part can run in the browser. Part can run in the service worker. Like, you can have the same components running in any of these environments, and you can do as optimal as you want to say personalize this area at the edge very fast. The rest comes from cache, client, server, etc., which is kind of fascinating here. But I'm also, one other thing I want to throw into the mix that is top of mind, I think, when people are building frameworks, is how do you make the project itself sustainable and I almost want to say growable, adoptable, I guess. So one thing that sort of was really important to Mono in particular, but as well, I can definitely say for Michiko, is like, how does this fit into the scope of like what Builder is building? How is this sort of something that's not just we'll host your quick app for you, right? That's been done, as we've seen. That's not something we're doing here. How does this become something sustainable that is sort of beneficial to the business and platform of Builder, and not too coupled and not too decoupled, which I think makes for like an interesting situation when thinking, okay, if you're going to build something new, it's going to need resources now and over time. And I can add a brief commentary here. The thing that we're noticing like crazy is the ability to deliver applications in a performant way is, it's almost like something, I've seen this happen a lot. I don't want to call out specific companies, even though I'm dying to, but won't. There's been this trend to want to be faster. And some people start to realize, what if we just said we're faster? And they just start marketing, we're faster, we're fast. And people start shifting their focus away from solving the problem and to marketing that they've solved the problem. But without data, you can still we have the data on just take the PageSpeed Insights mobile score for any website on any of the platforms, providers, etc. You're not going to get good results. And it becomes a very frustrating problem, especially when, in the case of Builder, we're trying to take it one level further, is not just say you can deliver the application performantly, like a static application. Static applications still have performance issues because of the JavaScript overhead, the JavaScript tax. Not just a dynamic application, not just a personalized application. That's where Builder starts coming in and saying, hey, we want to configure in this visual way an A/B test of personalization. but take it all the way end to end to having a developer or a non-developer being able to create these things, these personalized variations, these A/B tests. And, we've been pushing the envelope on the pure API side, right? At the end of the day, Builder is just an API. It gives you this visual editor to compose components, but it delivers over an API. Everything after that API call is not in our control anymore. Yet we want this sort of end vision of end-to-end sort of dynamic, personalized, relevant content, and the ability for a business, a developer, to not have to worry about hard coding all of these things, just build components, integrate a component, and the rest of the sort of business users, non-developers, marketers, merchandisers, whatever, to be able to run with it. And they're basically in that loop. There was this big sort of hole that was just desperately needing to fill, one that we wanted to show end-to-end best practices with Builder on our own website. So luckily our own website gets 95 plus on a mobile PageSpeed Insights, passing core web vitals, all that good stuff. We caught recently that we accidentally snuck in a main thread JavaScript file, like the score teetered, and I realized, we snuck a script in. It needs to be in Party Town. So maybe we'll add more tooling to catch this stuff in the future. But the idea of how this can be something that, people explore quick, they see that you need to sort of have an option to be able to create and manage content anyway. So Builder will be a option. It's got a unique approach. So it's, hey, you may like this, you may not. That's fine. What we want to see is these applications get faster. But I'm curious, Manu, this was a big consideration for you coming in. Like, I'm curious sort of how you think about this topic as well, building a framework. How does that grow and how does that tie to a larger business? How do you feel about that? I mean, what do you think, even you can even answer more broadly if you like, of just like, what do you see out there as sort of best practices, bad practices? Because we want to give something to the community and we all benefit in a good way. So it's sustainable. And we don't want to lie to ourselves. We don't want to do like some people I see saying, it's like, oh, we're just doing this for the good of the world. It's like, that can, stop working. That can kind of peter out the resources and the ability to invest in a project. So I'll shut up now. Please, Manu, jump in. I'm curious your thoughts.
I think so the way I see it is that we are kind of like into a new generation of front end, and it's like in many different. It's like I can imagine this trend of going up in functionality. Like developers are building more and more functionality, right? Websites are becoming more and more like the experimentation table. Like it's a lot of things happening. It's not only getting more because of the functionality, it's getting more the application is getting bigger also because of the amount of the marketing experimentation, right? And this new generation, I think, or not new generation, but this kind of new paradigm tries to solve the problem and kind of try to break the correlation between this explosion of functionality and things that a website can do, and break it with the correlation with the amount of JavaScript, right? Because if you see it right now, it goes correlated, all going up, and doesn't seem like it's going to stop, right? And I think what Builder does is like the whole company is trying to solve this problem from the 3 points of view. Like it's first party code, Quick it can solve that, right? Quick is fundamental to solve this problem. Then Party Town was the other big thing, right? Is that how we, the marketing people, marketing team, the rest of the company wants to add something, right? So how do we control that? And then the other thing is, how do we make websites to be like a living thing of an organization, right? It's not only the developers, and you will be fooled yourself if you think that in a startup you will be the only one making changes to the landing page or the product, right? It's literally the most people can do the changes, right? And how do we keep this performance, and how do we keep this with a good UX? There are things that cannot be solved like independent. And I think Builder is such a good place to. I found like the right place to solve it, because it's the place where you can have like all the feedback, all the whole context. So that's kind of what my memory is, and why I think it fits right with the whole like platform. I don't know.
No, it's definitely a fascinating area, broadly speaking. I mean, there's so much innovation going on in the broader ecosystem. It's like from the way you manage and deploy content, from the way you sort of build the front end versus manage third-party scripts. It is a fun area to be in. I wanted to also be able to take a moment to answer some of the questions we have. We learned recently that we can do this super cool thing that we've seen Ryan do in his streams, which I think he's still wrestling with his internet. So maybe we'll catch him another time, or maybe he'll be able to sneak in at the end. But I thought this is a super interesting question. I think I know the answer, but Manu has particularly a lot of experience with Go. So Manu, you want to give your take on this one?
I think, Quick doesn't depend on Node, right? Like we already support Dino. Like it's not like we have the best DX. We have this conversation with Fresh, this other framework that they're kind of trying to solve the whole developer experience with that and kind of partner, and we can already kind of run it. And then we can run Quick and the optimize and all the tooling in the web workers, and nothing makes me think that BAT will not work. In fact, it will. If we didn't have any more things to do, I think it will be like kind of the fun project to jump into. There's so many things to work right now, but definitely yes.
And you're saying like a non JavaScript like environment, so even like Java, Python, something like that, to make Quick work with that. Because there is what is the project? Oddly enough, it's Quick.js spelled correctly. Is a binary that provides the JavaScript runtime that I believe it's a WASM file, or I believe something like that, where it can run in any of the frameworks. And I know that's something that could be looked into for sure, to allow Quick to run in basically
JavaScript runtime, right? I mean, even if it's in Go, like it runs in Java, you need to run JavaScript, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
I think BAT uses which one? GSC from Apple.
Oh, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure they implemented the JavaScript engine. I'm not quite sure. I read somewhere in Twitter that they use GSC from WebKit, but I don't know. Maybe someone in the comments can.
Yeah, and I think the big point is like we've also made a huge effort with Quick to make sure that it's not a Node.js project. Like there is no Node.js APIs, and that's on purpose because we know we want to run great in Dino, and pretty sure it does. Don't hold me to that because we still got to test more, but really Quick is just JavaScript. It should be able to, we actually have it already running inside of Cloudflare workers and Netlify. So we know that it's just JavaScript and it's not tied to a very specific environment.
Yeah, so in Quick you have the optimizer, and after the optimizer is you can kind of like, it's not bundling, it's like super fast transform. It's like ESB speed. And after that output, it's just like JavaScript. So there's nothing special about it. There's not any magic. Like the magic ends at the end of the optimizer, and then you just run the code. So, and
on that note, that optimizer is a WASM file and has native binary files. And so that itself, like it's being used inside of our service worker on the website. And so like the optimizer itself isn't tied to Node or anything like that.
So one other area of questions I think is relevant here too. One maybe a quick one. I'm actually curious, Oren, what compile.js languages are kind of interesting to you? Because shake your heads, Manu and Adam, if you disagree, but should be fine, right? At the end of the day, essentially JavaScript with JSX, maybe there's ways to get around it, just need to be passed into the optimizer to do the splitting, and then, can be optimized for delivery. So a compile.js language should be fine. It's funny because I haven't been asked that question in a while. It seems like TypeScript just won. And so it's like, it doesn't seem to come up lately, but I'm curious if there's some new interesting things sort of going on in that realm. But aside from that, one thing that's kind of coming up here too, it's come up in a few places, like Quick within Astro, or I think part of what's maybe being referenced or maybe alluded to with Quick within a Go framework is potentially that idea of my server is serving the bulk of a page, but I've got some interactive region powered by Quick, maybe akin to like how you'd have, React power a hamburger menu within a Shopify store. It's otherwise a server side using their liquid templating system. And so one thing that came up is, Quick until, 3 hours ago only had server side routing. So maybe it didn't make sense. As of now, maybe it does make sense. But the trade-offs are interesting. Like let's say you used an Astro, and so you've got a pure no JavaScript way to deliver the page, and you want a sprinkle of interactive elements with Quick because you want to be more of that pure HTML mindset, but you acknowledged interactivity is necessary for some areas. To be honest, it's not something we've discussed. I've discussed with the group internally much. I'm curious, actually, Adam or Manu, your point of view on this type of use case or approach.
I was gonna let Manu. I don't have a good answer. I don't really know. I haven't put much thought into it, to be honest. I don't know if I can talk smart about it.
I mean, resumability is a new thing. I mean, just like people asked, or we talked about future of web routing, doesn't mean we know what the definitive answer should be. We're explored server-side routing. Does work great, but there still is a reload. Your third-party scripts are all still re-executing. There's stuff happening. Then there's client-side, which quick, I was really interested in the inner HTML approach and still am. But the client-side approach, given how Quick is able to shred your component into the tiniest piece, just pull out the rendering bit and run that, is pretty interesting and actually may be a pretty dang suitable, that may be the better approach. We're finding out. Like all things we do in Builder in general, it's very much adapting to sort of what the ecosystem is needing. We're not trying to stand on a totem pole and say, this is the way to build. Yeah. That was actually maybe one of the Angular approach mistakes in a sense. We want it to be like, well, what are your needs? How can it fit? And Adam, please jump in.
Yeah, and I also think what's cool that I'm realizing with Quick City in building it out is like, sometimes it's like, well, do you want to static site generate your website, or do you want to do SSR on demand per user? And it's usually a pick one, right? And each one has a trade-off, stuff like that. With Quick City and Really Quick, it's like, well, you could pick and choose all you want, really, quite easily. Like we could have a majority of the docs directory be all static rendered, and we could have the shopping cart that could be SSR'd. And it's certainly not impossible to do with any framework. But with Quick in Quick City, that's very, very easy to do. And the code that you write, the actual components you write, the pages you write are identical. There's no difference between it. It really comes down to just which plugin you add to your Vite config. Of just like, I want to static site generate this entire directory. And then in your Cloudflare config or Netlify config, you just say like, well, for this page, let's SSR it. And that becomes fairly trivial, So like, I don't know if that answers the question, but I just feel like it makes it, we're not tied to the one true way of doing something. It's entirely up to your use case of how you want to run the components, either server side or client.
Yeah, and then the trade-off between SPA and MPA gets very, very thin, because before. So this was actually funny because I have this interaction in Twitter. I don't remember exactly who, but it was funny because they said, look, you can also have an MPA with React. And it's true, right? You just remove, and instead of using the link component, you just use an anchor. But my response was, yeah, but you still pay the cost of the SPA. Like you have everything there, right? And kind of the realization was that in Quick, it doesn't matter if you put an anchor or a link and you have client-side navigation. The initial amount of JavaScript is going to be the same, and it's going to be 0. So it doesn't matter, right? And then the other thing is that if you want an interactive page, so you might have like card and things like that, you probably are forced to make it a SPA, even though you don't need a SPA, just because every reload will be so expensive. Like every reload, like every navigation means the whole hydration thing. So you navigate, all this work, but you don't really need a SPA, right? Like you don't keep a state. And I think with Quick, you realize that you maybe not need a SPA. And if you need for this link an SPA, just use a link. I'm not saying like you have to choose yes and no for the whole application, but maybe for this link, you don't actually need it, right? Because the new page is not going to do any of the work, right? There's no JavaScript execution at all. So the trade-offs and the decisions change a lot. So that's why I think like in Quick, when you get a MPA, it's not like remove the script stacks and all the interactivity is gone, right? That's kind of the docs in other frameworks. Like you have to remove the scripts, and it's like, yeah, done, right? But here is different, right? And that trade-off is going to affect also the decision the developers make.
Yeah, for sure. And like, it really is in between the two. The MPA, multiple page application, is I'd almost say it's the harder one to do at first. Like from the SSR level at the server and the state going between different pages. That's kind of the harder one to do, and I think that we solved that with Quick City. And then we just sprinkled in the client side. It's like, well, instead of doing a full page request, let's prevent the click and just client side to the next thing. So it really comes down to, you can easily pick and choose which one you want to do without any effort. If you really want to have just SPA and there's absolutely no reason to change the URL, things like
per
that.
link, right? You can choose per link, right?
Like you almost go out of your way to make an SPA not work as an MPA with Quick. Like you have to if I click this button, I want to render this, like you're really going around how browsers work on purpose. Whereas with Quick City, it's, why wouldn't you just have it change, do a push state to the history. If I did reload, did a hard reload, it's going to reload right at the exact state I was at. I guess there's a reason not to do both. There is no reason not to do both, because it's just going to naturally be an MPA and also naturally be an SPA at the same time without any effort, if that makes any sense.
No, and so I'm kind of obsessed with this topic, and this was part of the motivation for mitosis, like the compiler of write a component once, compile out to every framework. But the specific thing that I liked with that project, the project has its own trade-offs, its own niche that it works really well for, but Quick embraces in its own way that I love, is just this idea. I've always hated the idea that you have to couple developer experience and runtime, meaning you have to make a choice when starting a project. Am I building a project optimized for complex client-side single page application or simple static multi-page application? Like, these are things, before you write a line of code, you're going to make a choice and you're going to pay for that forever. and if you want,
I was going to say, there's endless resources of saying the trade-offs. You got to pick one. You only can pick one, and you have to understand the use cases. That's, sorry to interrupt, but that's I think it's interesting how everyone always brings up these same trade-offs.
No, that's it. And you start going deeper and deeper and deeper down one road, and then you realize you need the other one. You're rebuilding everything. And you may like the DX of this, but the runtime of that. And with React server components, you may like, should this be a server component or a client component? It's just all these things. And the world is so much better where you can just write a component, and it can be later you decide it's optimized for this or that, or it's optimized for them all. Ryan, did your internet get fixed?
Yeah, my internet finally got fixed. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. They've tried to blame it on whatever, and then they're like, "We'll send a technician out," and I'm just sitting there, and I'm like, what the? And they're like, "Oh, it's going to be 24 hours," and then what do you know? While I'm waiting on the phone with them for an hour, it just fixes itself.
Yeah, that's amazing.
The other day, I also have one of these meetings, and just before I wanted to sit in a different place because I usually work in a different place with a different background. And I came, and just before the meeting, I was moving the cables, and they disconnected the router. So it was also damn it, the worst moment to have an outage. And of course, it takes 10 minutes to boot up. I know.
It's always at the worst time. Well, let's do this. Let me briefly address one question came in that I want to address. It says Quick is 30 kilobytes. I want to clarify, Quick is not 30 kilobytes. But let me address this one question really quickly. And then Ryan, maybe I can get you briefly caught up, and we can get some of your backstory on the choice to build Solid. Just this one really quickly, because it's top of mind. Is there lag on first interaction? No, because of prefetching. So I think we have a doc specifically on this. Maybe someone can throw in the chat. Does all that have to be loaded to run? So also no. So you just need the bootloader, which is less than a kilobyte, drifts around a handful of bytes. And prefetching will make sure that sort of everything is instant, and the amount of code prefetched is incredibly minimal. It's not even entire components.
Sorry, no. The question is just they asked about the React thing. I thought you
exactly.
The quick runtime itself, though, if I'm correct, is about 14 kilobytes. So you don't need it when it first loads. Prefetch that in the background. I wonder where the 30 kilobytes was coming from. It's smaller than that.
Maybe it's a dev build.
Okay.
It might be also unminified, ungzipped.
Mishko likes to write a lot of comments, so it could be a megabyte.
And one thing to add too about this startup time is that it doesn't have to execute and then do the hydration process to then realize what it has to do after that, right? And so the interaction time wasn't there wasn't something beforehand to like, let's catch everything up, let's run this application, let's do everything first, and now you can be interactive. It's rather like you kind of skip that whole chunk first and go straight to the reactivity code instead when you clicked it.
Steve, might you select the question about the React? I'm just dying to respond to it, and then we can just go on.
Yeah, do you mean the last piece? What's the SSR cost of Quick versus React?
No, the one that says that if it's like, if there is something like Astro for, like if we can replace Astro or cover that use case, because it was kind of connected to the, I don't know if you can, I don't know where it is right now.
You might be able to highlight it, or you could just speak to it. If you remember the
Yeah,
gist,
so
you could speak
so it
to
was
it.
actually like a question like, oh yeah, could Quick play the same role as Astro? I wanted to connect it with the previous topic because we were talking about SPA and MPA and the trade-off between choosing those. Yes, and that was actually, it's already working. We have already Quick React. If you do npm init Quick, you have an option to have React. And the thing is that you get the same benefits of Astro in the sense that you will you can SSR React in Quick in the server and put it there, and then as some activity happens or it becomes visible or some reactivity changes, it can partial hydrate that little piece of that island. So yes, right now we only have Quick React, but probably want to play with something else. Maybe Solid.
Should be pluggable. Yeah, Solid would be a really, really good one. We could do Vue, but we're not sure what Evan's opinion of us is. And so that, I think probably deferring some of the stuff to the community will ultimately be great. You know, people could just build their own adapter. Hopefully there's some simple hooks into. But I want to circle back to Ryan. Usually we end the stream now. I definitely want to go over, because there's one specific question I'm dying to know, because I don't even know if I asked it. I think I know some of the background. But like Ryan, when you started building a framework, were you like, that's what I want to do? I want to spend the next 10 years of my life grinding through a framework and dealing with every challenge that happens with that, from code to ecosystem to everything. What was your Genesis story?
Yeah, no, that was not what I was looking for. It's funny. Yeah, I was hoping. I'm so sad I missed most of the stream, because we actually had I don't know if you guys mentioned this, a really rare opportunity to have almost several serial framework authors is the best way to put it, because I mean, Mishko isn't joining us today, but I think we have like 6 frameworks between between all of us,
and in different platforms. I think that the native time pass.
Right. So you'd think, well, maybe that's what, you know, always were going for. Like, yes, I'm going to do this, but it was not the case at all. Honestly, I think so much of authoring and frameworks and people using it comes down to preference, really. Like initially, like it is a DX consideration. And for me, I just liked the way some frameworks work that weren't popular anymore, and they needed updates, so to speak. So I got into working on Solid simply because I liked these reactive primitives and I liked that approach. And React, and when it kind of came on the scene and really changed things, and mostly in a positive way, just killed all those kind of frameworks dead almost instantly. It was just like point drop. And I was like, no, there's still potential here. So like this was never about, it's funny thing is it wasn't even about other people. I mean, it was about me. It was like, and my company at the time, I was like, I want to keep on doing this stuff. I just didn't want to switch to React. I just didn't like it. You know, it just wasn't my preference. So that's what got me started. I think what's interesting is when you know, because I also work on Marco, and when you kind of like have been in this for a while and doing this stuff, you're kind of like, you start seeing, well, there is DX considerations, but there's also UX considerations. There's so many decisions, so many of these little points. So it's like, at one point, yeah, it was just, for me, it was just a way of, you know, doing things I like. But then at a certain point, you're just like, maybe, and not all the experiments turn out that way, but maybe you create something quite good, not just from some preference thing, but in an objective sense that's actually changes how things work. And that's what I felt like happened with Solid. And then things just kind of kept on rolling from there, because like, even as I said, certain elements of Solid exist in newer Marco stuff, and you start seeing the patterns, and you start seeing the benefit that can happen, in terms of the way our collective mindset moves forward. So things don't get stuck at a single moment in time, and our thinking evolves along with the technology. So there's this constant readjusting of boundaries and figuring out how to best do stuff. And I said, I really, unfortunately, missed most of this because I had so many thoughts on this topic. So many.
I wanted to ask you, Ryan. It was more because of you actually look into how some of React works and you didn't like it, but did it inspire you, or it was more like that, or it was like or it was only because I love React, but I just think I can do better.
Yeah, it was actually. When I took stuff from React, it wasn't because I was trying to improve React. I was just like acknowledging. I'm like, okay, you guys are kind of right about a couple things. Like, you do a lot of things really well. Like, let's face it. It was just like there was problems with those older libraries, but I wasn't like, okay, I'm gonna fix React or make it better. I was more like, I'm gonna learn why React was so successful at ousting these other approaches and other frameworks, and then see if that can apply there. It was more like that. I was never trying to make React better. I was never trying to even compete with React. I just wanted to try and go, okay, unidirectional flow. What's the impact? Okay, and these are things you naturally find while you're working at a company building projects too. You're like sitting there and you're like, you're building stuff, and some junior dev or some bug happens, and you look at it and you're like, what the hell are you guys doing? And this happens more when you get further away and you get a little bit senior, and you kind of look, you're like, no, try this pattern. And they're like, but then you kind of, it lingers with you for a bit. You're like, why did they do the other pattern? Why was this the intuitive approach they went? Maybe it isn't their mistake. Maybe it's like our mistake. Like, maybe the way I teach it, maybe the way I train it, but also just like, does this pattern make sense? Is it intuitive? And for me, it meant over time, I'd watched our code bases in Knockout get more restrictive, and I added all these like rules, and like, no, you guys, when you guys use effects, you got to make their dependencies explicit. That was like one of the rules back in the day. They're called computeds in Knockout, but it doesn't matter. But it was like, I made a standard. I'm like, pure calculations, you don't need the dependencies, but for like effects, you need them. And after a while, I started extrapolating from that kind of learnings, and I'm like, okay, maybe two-way binding is bad. Maybe unidirectional flow is good. And that's the kind of stuff I took from React. It was actually things that, like, I even though they told me, and I watched the Flux presentation and did all that, I was still kind of skeptical. I'm like, I can do stuff the way I like. And over time, and this is probably kind of the flaw or problem with senior developers anyways, like getting stuck in their ways a little bit, but I started reinforcing patterns where I actually started to appreciate elements of React's design decisions over time, and they just started influencing my thinking. A lot of people know that I'm like not a fan of two-way binding, and I was not that way even in 2017, 2018, back when I started Solid. I was still like trying. I guess 2017, I was still trying to make two-way binding work, and I was like still using those patterns, and just at a certain point, stepping back, and you kind of go, okay, let's readjust and redefine. Like, reactive libraries worked this way 10 years ago. Maybe things weren't correct. Like, maybe we need to rethink these things slightly.
Regarding what you said, I feel like when you from the outside you see how they make the framework, and it's like, oh, they are genius, right? And sometimes when you get into the idea and you get into the details, you start to realize all these things, like, yeah, let's make props mutable, right? And then as you keep going, you realize that it's not going to work, and then everything comes from the outside, like, yeah, it's clear, but it went through a lot of like.
Right. And what's challenging is this isn't like a single path forward. At the end of the day, we don't all like get together and agree and pat ourselves on the back. Well, I mean, subgroups of us do. There's like all the people working on MPAs right now that are having a good time, being like, yeah, islands and MPAs. But to a certain degree, there's lots of paths you can do there. Like, for example, I'm very big on worrying about the permissiveness of reactivity, how it flows around and how it can cause, butterfly effects if you're not careful. But like on the Svelte side, they've taken completely different design decisions. They do have two-way binding. They do this stuff, and it works for them because they've made other decisions, right? Like they have a compiler that kind of knows, and it's very hard to get reactivity out of the file. Like there are stores, but just the core of it means that for the most part, a lot of my gripes about two-way binding don't actually apply in Svelte because of the design decisions they've taken. But those design decisions also have trade-offs, like ones perhaps that I wouldn't make, not perhaps, definitely wouldn't make. But like it's one of those things where like there's these ranges. It's never like a black-white kind of thing. There's these ranges, these zones.
So Ryan, one question I'm dying because I kind of remember this history, but I kind of don't. There was a point in time, if I remember right, where some of the approach you were taking, and they probably still exist this way. I remember DOM expressions. They're like, hey, we can compile JSX to these very fast expressions, and you can choose your own reactivity framework. I remember MobX was one supported. You had others. And I remember over time, it seems like you were taking this approach of be minimal, and then some backstory on the quick stuff we talked about was we tried to take this very minimal approach. Let's do as little as possible well. And then you just kind of get sucked into this hole of doing more and more because the incompatibility of the new approach with the existing approaches. And you kind of land in, you maybe didn't set out to like, yeah, exactly what Solid is today may not have been the first thought of what you wanted, but you kind of get pulled in the direction. Like, how did that happen? And how do you feel about sort of where it went and how it's going?
Definitely. And that touches on two really important topics. It touches on framework agnosticness, and it touches, actually that's probably the main one it touches on. I started DOM expressions because actually, I'm going to backpedal a little bit further. When I first envisioned Solid, it was a solution for web components. I think actually I might have that in common with a couple people here, but I was really big on web components, and I was like, I want to do reactivity in web components. I was already doing it in my work with Knockout, and I already built a generic web component wrapper because, again, Knockout didn't work with like Skate.js or any of the generic ones. They all assumed re-renders, and as you know, we don't re-render. Same with Knockout. So I'd kind of had this web component thing, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to break the problem into three spaces. Rendering, like DOM, container, which is the web components, and state management, which is the reactivity. And as long as I can swap those three as I want, I'm just going to focus on one, make a library out of that, and people can mix and match if they want. Web components are a perfect container. They're on this side. Don't have to worry about that. Rendering, today I want to do it this way. Maybe I'll do it in a different way. VDOMs, whatever, I'll swap it out. And that was like on the list, but whatever. I was testing things. But then I said I want to focus on state management. I went through a lot of approaches, and eventually I came across a library called SJS, or Surplus was their actual renderer with JSX. And if you look at Surplus, you're going to see, again, remarkable similarities to Solid because they had done the 80%, 90% of the stride on that JSX fine-grained reactivity rendering thing. And I wanted to work on the project. I wanted to help out. I was ready to drop my efforts, and to merge the projects or figure out. But I'd spent so much time on reactivity, I was really into proxies, which they weren't. And the compiler wasn't smart enough to how to handle proxies. So I was like, and it was a custom compiler. And I was like, you know what? It's so funny now in hindsight, people like trying to get off Babel. But I was like, everyone was like, yeah, let's move these things to Babel. And I was like, well, if I'm going to move something to Babel and go the effort of making this fine-grained compiler, let's make it generic. Like put in any reactive system you want that kind of works this way. And that's what I did. It was supposed to be a compiler for S, like a surplus enhancement. It was supposed to, and then while I was at it, I was like, okay, well, let's do Knockout and MobX, because I saw really early like in benefits to this when I was benchmarking it. And then I was like, I actually even pulled in Vue. It's funny because Vue has Vapor that's coming out, but I basically made Vue Vapor about 2 or 3 years ago. It's on the JS framework benchmark. If you don't believe me, there's a long history of it. It's there. Vue RxJSX is basically Vue Vapor like 3 years ago. It's been on the benchmark the whole time. So you can see the perf there. But essentially, I was trying this generic thing. But you know what the problem is? And this is a problem I've had almost with every agnostic solution. Over time, it consolidates. I find that it's never quite what you expect. The things do the opposite thing you expect. Like web components are probably responsible for more new JavaScript frameworks than any other technology added to the platform. So instead of consolidating, they fragmented. And if you go the other way to look at it, framework agnostic solutions usually end up consolidating on like the thing that best fits the pattern. And if that framework agnostic solution is really good, you end up usually causing, like as I said, the things to be focused on. Like if the best way to make islands for Astro is Preact or whatever, then you'll see over time that Preact will just take over the show. That's the thing. And with DOM expressions, at a certain point, because I was building to that target, Solid just ended up being the best DOM expressions library. Like it was just inevitable. I was putting the work in. I was maximizing the way to leverage that compiler. Of course, the reactive system would be tuned a bit better for that use case for rendering and all that. If you look at it, Solid doesn't always win at all the reactive benchmarks, but it is very good at things that involve hierarchies or like spitting out and creation, which is why it's really good at DOM rendering, because it's a lot of creation and memory allocation, and Solid's reactivity is like a perfect match for that. There might be other reactive frameworks that are better at, or libraries that are better at updates, but that isn't the thing that's going to win DOM benchmarks. So it's over time, I found that I just wanted to do more there, add more features, and I tried to keep it generic as long as I can. It's, believe it or not, MobX JSX like supports like suspense, like it doesn't have transitions or anything, because I haven't like gone in and like a thing, but I did make the mechanisms that supports SSR, but it needs, you know what I mean? Like it needs more work, and these are ultimately had to get delegated to the prototype pile, which I mean they always kind of were. So there's an argument for bringing it in, because the truth of the matter is, if I could bring DOM expressions to Solid, I probably could make things even slightly more optimal. It just works that way. There's like a little bit of a barrier. I've done my best. I've made it so that it gets compiled, so you don't have to worry about tree shaking. Like it's actually completely tree shakeable. That was an important goal. But like always, when you make something more specific, you can optimize it more. General solutions are less optimizable. It's just kind of the thing. So yeah, it's kind of funny because you're right. I did start at a place where nothing seemed to be compatible with Solid. It still kind of is not the case today. So you might think that would lead me to build more stuff. But it's funny, my first take at building more stuff was trying to be more generic. That whole XKCD comic, forget about those 14th standards, come up with the 15th standard kind of thing. It's real, because I said, as soon as you make something generic, it ends up just consolidating on the best way to do it, which is, I said, no, I think there's benefits and merit to that. Like both ways. Web components are a great migration tool. They're like a great way to move from one framework to another framework, right? And similarly, framework agnostic is a good kind of thing for bringing inflow. Like, I mean, you got to put it out there, right? Like, just throwing this out there. You can use React components in Quick, but will React components ever be the best way to use Quick? No, they could never actually be the best way to, they'd never actually be the best way to use Quick. At a certain point, things do change, and you don't benefit actually from the reuse. I've been thinking about this a lot this week, and actually probably going to talk about that a little bit on my stream tomorrow, where a couple of these guys will be joining me to talk about Quick City. But essentially, Dan Abramoff responded to something where I think Sean Wang Swix had mentioned about, it's a shame that you have to rewrite all your components. And he was like, you know what? Every once in a while, you want to rewrite all the components. Like things have moved, boundaries, perceptions have changed. It's okay, And I mean, this is why I think React Core Team's awesome, and why Dan is awesome, because the incumbent, like the guy who's at the top says, rewrites are inevitable, is like, that's a powerful message. And I that's why I view this as a balance. Like it's not like as simple as like future proofing with agnostic. That doesn't future proof.
Yeah. So is it fair to say that two of the biggest reasons things consolidate is to have very streamlined happy paths, like a good developer experience is just the one way to do things simple. I guess simpler to maintain. You're not maintaining or having to worry about such wide constraints. So you just optimize the happy path. But also I think, you point out something interesting, which is when the key selling point of a project is performance, it kind of becomes mandatory because, we saw React ecosystem blew up. And, we saw people, I did this myself. You make a React app, you heard it's fast. You make a React app and you install 100,001 things. And you're just like, wow, it does so much. And then later you realize, oh, this is slow. And it becomes a problem you deal with later down the road. I'm curious, this is something we're dealing with. It's funny how, you brought up cycles of fragmentation and consolidation. And we see that all over the place. Like one thing that's happening in e-commerce is this great unbundling of stuff, right? You had these behemoth platforms like Shopify or Salesforce Commerce Cloud, and they were everything in one, and they evolved to a point of being jack of all trades, master of none. And so you see people going to unbundling, specialized services for each part of the puzzle, API driven, etc. But now we're already finding things kind of being consolidated again because it's hard to use 1,000 tools. It's hard to connect 1,000 tools. And when you're thinking of like the JavaScript landscape and SolidJS, where do you think this is going? Like, do you see, as a million ways you could take that question. I almost don't want to give any guidance. I'm just curious your raw thoughts.
Right. Okay. Here's the thing. I actually also think that certain types of developers and certain people gravitate to certain things because they get different things out of the development or product experience. Like this isn't just, when I say develop, I don't mean just programmers and engineers. I mean, actually product people. I think like the whole thing, if you view it like a product, there's definitely this element of this bundling, unbundling where people sit. Like I'm personally always an unbundler. I love refactors. So I'm always sitting on that side. It's very awkward when I get pulled into stuff like meta frameworks. Like I am working on a meta framework with Solid Start, but like it is not my comfy place. I like redefining boundaries. I like that. So generally speaking, yeah, we've watched this cycle. The thing is, I wonder if it's like there's probably some kind of economic comparison, but if the bundling and unbundling cycle starts getting really, 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 really tight and it's all kind of escalating up, is that signs for a crash? Like that's something I've wondered about. Because I get concerned with the complexity there. Each cycle, you can hope to reshift and reboundary so that you can essentially make things simpler. When you unbundle, you basically break apart and adjust the boundaries so that you can simplify because where your thinking is, it's changed. When you bundle up, you pull those pieces together now in the new form. And you do this over and over and over again. But like sometimes there's changes, like when I was a .NET developer and we were doing stuff that way with and there was many iterations of it with things like where these like update panels and like live replacing isomorphic full apps where you essentially could like have all the state serialization automatically happening, and you write one app kind of like we do today, except it was the server was the boss. And what you basically there's similarities to that even to what's going on now, but it got really complicated. Like you'd write everything in a single language, C#, let's say, and it would write all the JavaScript for you and obscure that, and you'd build these apps that were perfectly isomorphic. If that sounds familiar, it does. And it got to a point of complexity that it collapsed at a certain point. Like, sure, there's things still out there, but at a certain point, people are like, I just like putting JavaScript on the page. Like when single page apps emerged, it was like a reimagining, rethinking, just not even a rebundling. Like it was like a revolution. Like it was, and when things kind of get to that level of complexity, I sometimes get concerned that like that's where it's heading again. And I feel like this has happened a few times in the history of the web. And are we at another one of those turning points? Because those bundling, unbundling things are getting pretty tight right now. And we're clearly realizing that there's stuff we still have to work on and stuff that's changing. So yeah, I don't know if I'm forecasting a crash. I'm just thinking, maybe these resets have to happen at a certain point.
I see resets in some aspects, but I see a progression, right? I don't know exactly if we are going to come back to the same stuff. Like in some ways it might look like it, but I think like I don't see this going back totally. Like I see the very clear story of jQuery fixing JavaScript. Then you have AngularJS is like let's make an app, like framework to make big apps, single page application. Then it's like, oh, let's simplify this. Let's make like a library. And I think that was like the big experimentation phase where everyone is trying things, CSS, how to make CSS. And I think React was amazing for that. Like it was the best testing everything, right? We were getting ideas from Remix, from this meta frameworks, from all these libraries built on top of React. And I think, I don't know, like from my perspective now, it's like, let's reimagine React itself. Like now we are kind of figuring out how to build bigger application. Let's rethink how React itself, and why React is bad is because it's not taking too many things into account. Let's see what it really needs. And it's why, like Solid is, no. Reactivity needs to be part of that. Like it's not something you can put outside, right? And Quid says also like, no. And you need to put this other thing too, because it's very important. But from there on, you give, but we are still taking the idea of meta framework because this is as good. You still allow some, you don't want to bundle everything in this core, right? And I don't know what is going to be the future, right? But I still see like the forward path. I don't know if you guys.
Yeah, sorry, I keep on jumping in on every answer, but I'm just making up for lost time here. Yeah, like, and there's definitely progression when you hear me talk about the progression of React coming out of like other frameworks that were out at that time, like Angular and stuff. Like, to me, because we all want to denote something as a revolution. Often when we're in the head of it, we're just like, yes, this is the new thing. This is the next generation. Sorry, let's go. But essentially, and the reality is these things have threads that go much farther back and they progress and it's incremental, right? Like how we get there. You look far enough, you can trace those roots and you can find that if you are paying attention at a wider scope, you see hints of what's going to come before they happen. Like definitely, like as I often use a comparison where I say that React components were actually just an evolution of MVVM. Now that's an interesting take for sure. But like you can see the evolution from MVC to MVVM to React components. It's the change of the role of the controller going from singleton to instance space, because state is a real thing on the client, which it wasn't as much on the server, to being grouping the view with the view model and calling that a component. Like essentially, for me, it's a step. If you look at it wide enough, it is interesting though, because yes, the whole spectrum, and as the historian will put it, will view it that way, because there's all these things happening at once. That's why I spend so much time trying to look so wide. I look into lots of technologies because I want to understand those kind of patterns. But it is interesting though that like when the change, especially like the base technology, changes enough that it does actually end up, from anyone who's not taking as wide of a scope, seem like that. For example, moving all your code from C# to JavaScript probably felt like a very, very big change. But if you look at it, the bigger trend was that we were moving more logic to JavaScript. We weren't writing the JavaScript in the case of the C# thing, but and the reason we're moving the logic JavaScript was because both of a need and because the browsers had improved the performance significantly enough that this was a viable approach. So like, yes, it is all just a progression. And for people who don't want to get surprised too much, don't want the JavaScript fatigue, I guess there's like no winning there completely, because it's like,
I wanted to ask you, how do you feel about people saying, oh, another framework? What's your take?
Yeah, I was going to say that too. Yeah.
Yeah, you got exactly, because I mean, this is what I'm getting at. Like, I'm rarely surprised by what the frameworks are doing in the framework space, because I understand and study that space. So it's difficult for me to adapt to that, because I've been just a student of JavaScript history or whatever, right? Like, so from that perspective, I don't get caught off guard, so I don't feel overwhelmed. Like you don't necessarily need to know everything in the same level of detail I do, but if you look at the trends and can get the notes, like the cliff notes or whatever, you can kind of walk the path and understand what's happening, and then not get like swamped by it. So the JavaScript, the whole fatigue thing was always tricky, because I mean, I don't know, I feel like it emerged in 2016 time period. And the fatigue is probably what's pushed the bundling at that time. early 2000, say 2009 through 2013, 14 was a very innovative time. It was like a renaissance because we finally freed ourselves, and we're like, from the JavaScript side, we're like, we can do whatever we want. We can try all these different patterns, single page apps, people doing all different things. It wasn't all just like React. Like there were other frameworks at the time, and even completely different approaches. Marco came up actually at that time doing something completely different, doing an MPA JavaScript framework, right? Which is unheard of at the time, but lots of ideas, people throwing it at the pot. And then at a certain point, it's too much, and the fatigue thing comes on, and we consolidate and we bundle, right? And that was 2015, Next.js, and like all those meta frameworks, create React app. It kind of like pushed everything together. And that was the response. And we spent like 3 or 4 years like that until everything kind of, people kind of were like, oh, things have stabilized and I feel confident, and, stuff's boring. But by the time anyone makes that observation, the underpinnings were already changing again. Like I love that. Last year, a whole bunch of people were like, I'm glad JavaScript's finally matured.
Oh no.
Oh no, do we lose Ryan?
He was going to make such a great point.
I know, it was like
I was waiting for
the suspense.
Yeah.
He actually is just waiting.
Yeah,
And frameworks at a stable place, and nothing's changing. And I'm just like, you guys.
Darn.
Sorry, is my internet still being shoddy? Am I back?
I
Yes,
think
you're
you're back. Yes.
Oh man,
Were you able to see where we lost you, so you know where to rewind to?
Oh, almost. I think so. What I was saying is, at a certain point, I guess around about a year ago, did you guys hear me start that thought? Yeah. That like I was on socials, on Twitter, and people were like, "Oh, I'm glad that things have finally kind of stabilized, and that basically, we JavaScript has matured, and we have these things, and it's almost boring. I'm glad for that." And I was like, thinking to myself, I'm like, the change is already happening if you follow the threads on the underpinning, right? Like when you get to that point where you think the stability has happened, there's a good chance like it's like Schrodinger, like that what you see, you can't see the change and innovation and like, feel it at the same time. So it basically.
It's happening. What if this is? I mean, one thing, the hilarious part is, Adam and Mono, you guys are on Ryan's stream tomorrow. Is that it?
Yes.
I was like, I hate to burst your bubble, but like this is.
Oof. I think it's catching up.
Okay. Sorry, guys. I don't know what's up. I probably should jump off soon because of this, but all I wanted to say was that he had outlined the dates at which stabilization had happened, like how long things hadn't changed. And immediately in my head, I saw that there was a 2-year lag on his dates compared to my dates. And I realized like, this is just that there's literally like a signal and then like something with a 2-year delay. So we're heading into interesting times.
Yeah.
Darn, I'm trying to get the good news is we can easily pick up on Ryan's stream with the two of you at least tomorrow on these topics, which I think Ryan was just alluding to as well.
Yeah, sorry guys. I'm just gonna wave by and say we'll catch up. We got the stream tomorrow.
We'll chat tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully this will be better.
Thank you for popping on, Ryan. Those guys will join you
Ryan.
tomorrow. Everybody watching here, join Ryan's stream tomorrow. Thank you for coming in. Okay, we could close out now too. Thank you everybody for watching. Go see Ryan's stream where you'll see Adam and Mono talk about Quick City, and I have a strong feeling it'll also be a part 2 in parts on why in the world would you be a framework, where are these things going, and maybe when you have that knowledge, sort of what you can do with it. I know we certainly think about future proofing, like how you can make sure that Quick is leveraging all the latest greatest. It's not like a back to something, it's forward to something new, and how that can carry you forward. So anyway, on that note, this is fun to go a little bit over. This is always fun to have Ryan. I'll be watching in on the stream that happens tomorrow. Thank you for everybody who joined and commented and everything. We'll be here same time next week. We have Tommy, designer Tom. We're going to do a different angle next week and talk about, actually I have to pick the topic, but he's actually extremely famous on TikTok, like 300,000 followers, and makes these amazing sort of UX tips. So we're going to try something new next week, but then back, we'll have Philip of Vue Storefront CTO the following week. Anyway, we'll announce the stuff and topics soon. Thank you all for joining. We'll see you next time.
See ya.